This also begets a question of how any group of people who are denied opportunities in traditional job markets are able to succeed in entertainment and nightlife. I was always a musical child. In a time long before Shazam, I had an encyclopedic knowledge of songs from so many different genres and obsessed over the music video countdowns I would play at the time. And one song that I was obsessed with growing up was this one. This is Robbie Rob's Boricua anthem, performed by CNC Music Factory featuring El General. This song is a raucous 9-minute romp featuring singing and toasting primarily in Spanish, starting with a skit involving a caller into a radio show, and moving into scenes of vibrant rhythms and punchy hooks. Now, as a kid, you don't really know why you gravitate towards the songs that you gravitate towards. It could just be how the song sounds to you or the catchiness of the rhythm. It was only as an adult that I learned the significance of this record per CNC Music Factory co-founder Robert Clavillis. Clavillis, as a Puerto Rican born and raised in New York City, felt that it was an innovative composition that was among the first to fuse house music with overt Latin musical elements. Which got me wondering, is there a synergy between Latin music and electronic music genres such as house? Now, in the past decade or so, we've had a host of conversations in the electronic music community about honoring the black roots of house music. Albums like Renaissance by Beyonce helped kick this conversation into the mainstream. Now, I do want to keep these conversations, which are incredibly true and valid, at the forefront of this discussion. And also, I want to take a small side quest and look into how Puerto Ricans specifically have contributed to electronic music as well. I believe that in having this conversation, we can gain a deeper understanding of the synergies that different musical traditions have in concert. Now, there's two disclaimers I want to give. One, I am not Puerto Rican. I am just a longtime house music fan that is interested in this topic. And two, being a young millennial, I was not alive for a lot of what I'll be talking about, so I do welcome input from the house music elders in the comments. In making this video, I hope I can tell a story that honors the resiliency and inventive spirit of the Caribbean, of which Puerto Rico is a part. You can consider this video to be a moderately deep dive on the Puerto Rican history of house music. Alright, pa'lante. When we're talking about house music, we're talking about a subgenre of electronic dance music that originated in the second half of the 80s. Essentially, the formation of the genre now known as house music was led by DJs present in gay clubs in New York and Chicago, particularly those which had a black clientele. Structurally, house music is distinct from other types of electronic music. A typical house music record is set at a tempo between around 125 and 135 beats per minute, and it has a characteristic beat known as 4 on the floor. 4 on the floor meaning a kick drum or in general percussion on each of the 4 beats of every measure. Importantly, this structure of 4 on the floor largely originates within disco music of the 1970s, which we know to be a predominantly black genre in its origins as well. Now, house music is produced with a majority of electronic elements, such as a drum machine and a synthesizer. However, house music also notably makes use of a lot of sampling. Sampling meaning taking other music textures from earlier recorded music like disco, funk, and soul, and as we will see, the Latin genres of salsa and merengue as well. As house music develops in the 80s, it starts to reach commercial success in the dance music market in the early 90s and continued to grow exponentially into the 21st century. And now, the house music structure is quite ubiquitous everywhere, with many different offshoots and regional forms present around the world. One of my personal favorite offshoots of house music is known as French house or French touch and originates in Paris in the late 90s. This subgenre notably makes use of extensive sampling, which I've written about before. Now, while the story of house music does cover a lot of international terrain, the scope of this particular story takes place in New York City. In New York City, we find a particular overlap of communities and demographics which allows for an ecosystem of house music to begin to flourish. One of these populations is the New York City Puerto Rican community, also known as New Yorkers. At the time of house music's inception in the mid-1980s, there was already a large Puerto Rican population in the mainland United States. This includes recent arrivals as well as people in the first and second generation of growing up in New York City, as well as people who went back and forth. Some of the people mentioned in the scope of this video, like Robert Clavillis, Louis Vega, and Kenny Dope, might be described as being members of Gen X, or the MTV generation. That is to say that as they are growing up, they are taking in a host of musical influences. Now, large-scale outmigration from Puerto Rico began in the post-World War II period. To give you an idea of the Puerto Rican community in New York City, the first Puerto Rican Day Parade was held in New York in 1958, and migration continued in large volumes throughout the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1980 census, there are 860,552 Puerto Ricans enumerated in New York City. According to the City of New York's own analysis, in 1990, Puerto Ricans make up 12% of the entire city population. Now, it's important to remember that Puerto Ricans enjoy freedom of movement throughout the 50 states, even though Puerto Rico is not itself a state. As a result, the migration of Puerto Ricans out from Puerto Rico to the mainland looks a little bit different from the migration of other groups, such as those who came through Ellis Island or those who came after the passing of the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act. That being said, Puerto Ricans also did face unique discrimination challenges as they moved out of Puerto Rico. Overall, this pattern of migration does not come without its own disparities. We have to keep in mind the after effects of colonialism on Puerto Rico, which leaves a lot of Puerto Ricans without generational wealth. In 1990, the poverty rate for Puerto Ricans in New York City was double that of the general population, and also more than 1/2 of Puerto Rican children lived below the poverty line. It goes without saying that there are differences between growing up on the island and growing up in the diaspora. Nevertheless, the cultural identity of Puerto Ricans in New York City is still somewhat singular and boxed in. This perhaps due to factors like the different linguistic background, a strong cohesive national identity, and frankly, anti-Puerto Rican bias from white New Yorkers, but that's a topic for a different video. Out of this fabric emerges a key character in this story, a man named Robert Clivillés. Now, Clivillés is not without controversy, but he remains integral to this story nonetheless. As we'll see, Clivillés embodies a particular Puerto Rican narrative that is interwoven with electronic music history. In 1987, Clivillés is one member of a short-lived group called Two Puerto Ricans, a Black Man, and a Dominican, who released a record called Do It Properly. Now, in my mind, even the name of this musical outfit is significant because it demonstrates the overlap of Black and Latinx communities in places like New York City, an overlap which extends to the genesis of genres like reggaeton in addition to house music. Do It Properly is an important record in this story, but we should also look at the history of Clivillés as a person. Now, Clivillés grew up in the Taft houses in Spanish Harlem. Spanish Harlem, also known as East Harlem, is a neighborhood of uptown Manhattan that has historically been majority Puerto Rican. According to Clivillés, his mother was born in Puerto Rico and came to the mainland at a young age, while his father grew up in Puerto Rico and came only as an adult. By Clivillés' own account, he had diverse musical influences and also had dreams of becoming a musician from a young age. Here is a quote from Clivillés speaking in an interview with the NYC Tastemakers blog. "I grew up in a housing building with 5 people sleeping in a bedroom, dreaming of the American dream. I don't think that's changed for people even now at my age. I think that it's become even more important now because dreaming has never left as part of being, of existing. You do want to succeed and be happy, and I think that succeeding these days or being relevant has been misdefined. We've dropped just the simplicity of living, cooking, dancing, being with families, playing an instrument, having that fun that money doesn't buy. That is way more satisfying than you being by yourself in the beach with champagne being successful." Now, it's interesting that Clivillés invokes the American dream here, and also that he juxtaposes it with this image of being by yourself on the beach drinking champagne. I would say there's now criticism by many Puerto Ricans of the Americans from the mainland who go to Puerto Rico to do that exact thing. In any case, Do It Properly is released first as a bootleg record in 1987 before getting an official release. It is particularly remembered as being a release that had both a freestyle mix and a house mix of the same track. This record is produced by Clivillés and David Cole, alongside veteran producer David Morales, who is the other Puerto Rican, and engineer Chep Nunez, who is the Dominican. This record, by all accounts, does well. It crosses over and it begins to cement Clivillés' influence in the New York City scene. Clivillés and creative partner David Cole go on to do remixes for established musicians such as Natalie Cole, Grace Jones, and Chaka Khan. Now, the real magic starts to happen in around 1990. Around this time, Clivillés and Cole form C&C Music Factory. C&C Music Factory is signed to Columbia Records and is challenged with recording their first album in 6 weeks. And in this trial by fire, they emerge with their most famous record and one of the most known records of all time. Gonna Make You Sweat, Everybody Dance Now. Now, say what you want about this record. You can say it's a meme, you can say it's a cheesy throwback. But I guarantee you, this record is still paying somebody's bills today. As C&C Music Factory, Clivillés and Cole released several albums throughout the early 90s. And we find Robbie Rob's Boricua Anthem on their album Anything Goes, released in 1994. Sadly, David Cole passes away in 1995. shortly after CNC Music Factory as an act goes on hiatus. CNC Music Factory could have a documentary or a deep dive of its very own, but I do want to focus on what I consider to be the resulting impact of CNC Music Factory in Clavillis's words. Quote, "We've won 5 American Music Awards, 5 Billboard Awards, 5 MTV Awards, and a Grammy under CNC Music Factory. Then we won a Grammy for Best Album on the Bodyguard soundtrack, and we're responsible for selling 250 million albums worldwide, 50 million singles worldwide, and dozens of worldwide awards." So I think it's significant, knowing how white the music industry is, that a Puerto Rican and a Black American man could come together and achieve this sort of cultural cachet and this sort of economic success. Perhaps the synergy speaks for itself. Around the same time that CNC Music Factory is finding its audience, another influential label is coming into existence, that being Strictly Rhythm Records. In the early 90s, Strictly Rhythm released massive house records, such as 1992's Follow Me by Ally US and 1993's I Like to Move It by Real to Real. Category is Songs I Danced to at My High School Prom in New Jersey. Now, the discography of Strictly Rhythm Records speaks for itself. In the scope of this video, it's important for me to uplift the likeness and voice of one person in particular, that being Strictly Rhythm label co-founder Gladys Pizarro. On the surface, Pizarro's story overlaps with that of Clavillis, if not directly, then certainly thematically. In an interview with AfroTaino.com, Pizarro is quoted as saying, "I grew up in Spanish Harlem in New York City. My family is from Puerto Rico, and we played all types of music in my house. I had a sister that loved rock music and R&B, and a father that blasted his salsa records so loud you could hear the music outside. I think because all these genres of music were being played at my house, it gave me an eclectic ear at a very young age. I was versatile with my musical upbringing, and living near the projects taught me about disco, R&B, and rap music. That's what the DJs used to play in the block and street parties." Now, I do want to emphasize how difficult it must have been for Pizarro as a Puerto Rican woman to operate in the music industry in the late 80s and early 90s. Women of color face discrimination in corporate America still today. I can only imagine what it might have been like in that time period. So I think it's really notable that in the scope of Strictly Rhythm Records' launch, Pizarro was able to platform many DJs and producers, including ones of Puerto Rican descent. Not only did it help build the scene, it was also smart business. In 1993, Strictly Rhythm releases the compilation This Is Strictly Rhythm Volume 3. The lead track from this compilation is Deep Inside, credited to Hard Drive, produced and written by a producer best known as Little Louis Vega. In that same interview, Pizarro recounts, quote, "Louis Vega came to my office and gave me a digital audio tape. He gave me the hard drive EP that consisted of 4 sample tracks. I waited for him to leave. When I heard the EP, I ran to Mark Finkelstein's office and told him I needed a contract right away. I needed to sign this track called Deep Inside. I knew this record was going to put Louis on the map. Now mind you, he was already on the map with his Latin freestyle productions and remixes, but this EP was going to transition him from freestyle to house. This EP is very special, and I knew I had an underground hit in my hands." And indeed, Deep Inside is a classic record which has been resampled and replayed many times over. From what Pizarro is saying, I do want to dive into the genre of Latin freestyle just a little bit. Now, Latin freestyle is a genre of music worthy of its own deep dive. As someone who grew up in New Jersey, this genre is ubiquitous for anyone who grew up in the tri-state area in the 80s and 90s. A brief description of Latin freestyle might be electronically produced pop music, typically about love and relationships, and produced and performed by artists of Latinx descent. I am so tempted to go on a tangent here because there are so many amazing records that come out of Latin freestyle. Change on Me by Cynthia, One Way Love by TKA, Spring Love by Stevie B. I mean, the list really goes on and on. I think we can't really have a conversation about 80s pop music artists like Tiffany and Debbie Gibson without acknowledging the impact and influence that Latin freestyle had. Thus, the notion of an act or producer coming out of the Latin freestyle market and transitioning successfully into house music is a pretty big one. In any case, Pizarro's contributions to platforming house music onto a large scale should not go without her own due flowers. Now, there were a few, but not many acts who managed to transition from the freestyle sound of the 80s to the house sounds of the 90s. Someone like Madonna may immediately come to mind, but in the scope of this video, I'd like to introduce you to one of her contemporaries whose story turned out a little differently. That being New York City's own Denise Lopez. Denise Lopez's discography is pretty modest, but I did want to mention her in the scope of this video because I think about it all the time. I can't tell you when I first heard Denise Lopez's record, Don't You Wanna Be Mine, but in the past 10 to 15 years of knowing about it, I've been singing it constantly. In any case, one of the most prominent mixes of the 1990 dance track was made by none other than Robert Clavillis in tandem with David Cole and C&C Music Factory. To me, this track embodies the playful and romantic lyricism of freestyle music while still carrying that fresh house sound that C&C Music Factory is known for. In the video, Lopez appears as a beautiful and honestly striking woman that's wearing a tailored men's suit and just really charming the camera. Information about Denise Lopez is a little bit hard to find. Best I can tell, she was born in 1958 to a Puerto Rican family and grew up in the borough of Queens. Early in her career, she played guitar and sang intermittently before getting signed to A&M Records. Her visibility began to rise with tracks like 1987's If You Feel It and 1988's Saying Sorry Don't Make It Right. Keep in mind that Lopez was around 30 years old when her big break came to her, which I think is pretty significant. At a time when she might have felt pressure to settle down, get married, and have a family, she was out there living her dream, and that's really cool. As we move into 1990, she releases the album Every Dog Has Her Day, which contains the track Don't You Wanna Be Mine. The album appears to have been released on a subsidiary label called Atomic Records, which strangely drops off as an imprint soon after the release of Lopez's album. I have little idea from this vantage point what transpired in 1990 with the release of Every Dog, but Denise Lopez as a public figure goes dark soon after. From what I can tell, she appears to be alive, but no one has heard from her in a very long time. I introduced Lopez into this conversation because I think it's important not just to celebrate the artists and acts that had big cultural impacts, but also the ones that had an impact on the hearts and minds of the public. I don't want to speculate on Denise Lopez in particular, but her story seems to have parallels to someone like a Q Lazarus, who was also active in the New York City music scene of the late 80s and early 90s and then disappeared due to personal struggles. So Denise, if you're out there, know that your music is still continuing to find an audience today, and we continue to love you and wish you the best. It's worth noting that the transition of disco to house music with genres like freestyle, high energy, and EBM in the middle is a time that also overlaps with a period of social conservatism. Former President Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980. This set of policies severely maligns communities of color across the United States. At this time, inner cities are also ravaged by the introduction of crack cocaine and the AIDS crisis. As to the effect that these policies had on people within Puerto Rico, I'd characterize the 80s into the 90s as a period of relative inaction from Washington as it pertains to the island. Any action that was taken, however, was somewhat detrimental. An archival article posted to UPI by author Digby A. Solomon asserts the following. Puerto Rico, a self-governing semi-autonomous U.S. territory, cannot vote in U.S. presidential and congressional elections, but it is heavily dependent on U.S. laws and federal spending. Its politicians are placing the blame for their troubles squarely at Reagan's feet. Quote, the increase in unemployment in Puerto Rico from 18% to 24% is mainly due to the policies of the Reagan administration, charged Baltasar Corrada del Rio, the island's non-voting congressional representative. Perhaps 25 to 30% of that level is due to cutbacks in federal programs. Reagan was especially criticized for singling out Puerto Rico for a $300 million cut in its $1.1 billion food stamp program, serving 60% of the island population. We can also take into account the massive tax breaks that mainland corporations received for operating in Puerto Rico with the introduction of Section 936 into the tax code in the year 1976. That is, corporations received tax incentives for operating on the island, but Puerto Ricans did not necessarily benefit from these jobs created. Thus, this further belief in trickle-down economics did really nothing to improve the net wealth of Puerto Ricans on the island. Its legacy, in fact, was developing Puerto Rico into a de facto tax haven, which has drawn the ire of anti-colonial activists on the island and the general public as well. Thus, through this time period into the 90s, Puerto Rico is undoubtedly reeling from this economic catastrophe. I say this to say that the exchange of Puerto Ricans from the island to places like New York City has many push and pull factors. It might be easy to say that the Puerto Rican DJs and musicians mentioned thus far are quite removed from the terrain of Puerto Rico and don't represent it, but I don't think it's that simple. Also, it's worth mentioning that New York City was not the only node of Puerto Rican contributions to house music. We can also give credit to acts out of Chicago. We can look at earlier records like Touch of Love by Liz Torres and Master C&J, and also later records like Fix My Sink by DJ Sneak, all of whom originated in Chicago. DJ Sneak in particular has the distinction of being shouted out by name by Daft Punk as one of their influences in the song Teachers, alongside Kenny Dope and Louis Vega. Back in New York City, Louis Vega is seeing the success of the record Deep Inside credited to Hard Drive. Around that same time, he is responsible for another landmark record, I Can't Get No Sleep by Masters at Work. The duo Masters at Work is composed of Louis Vega and Kenny Dope Gonzalez. The vocals on I Can't Get No Sleep are performed by Puerto Rican-born Linda Viera Caballero, known to the world as La India. La India would go on to have her own successful career in salsa and Spanish language pop, some notable records being Mi Mayor Venganza and Dicen que Soy, which my Spanish is subpar, but even I know that Dicen que Soy is a bop. In any case, I Can't Get No Sleep is still considered a classic of the golden era of house music. As with other topics in this video, Masters at Work deserve their own deep dive. But just know that their impact is such that Dua Lipa tapped them to remix on the Future Nostalgia remix album Club Future Nostalgia. So La India and her husband Louis Vega originate in the borough of the Bronx, where around this same time, another Bronx-born Puerto Rican musician is starting to grow her career. That being, of course, Jennifer Lopez. Now, Jennifer Lopez is not really a player in this story at all. J-Lo did touch upon dance music early in her career though with her cover of the third-party track, Waiting for Tonight. Let it be known that J-Lo originally hated the song when it was sent to her, saying that it was, quote, horrible and so cheesy. But it proved to be a smash hit, and J-Lo would return to house-inflected dance music later in her career with tracks like 2011's On the Floor, at a time when both Hispanic artists and EDM were more in prominence. Important to mention here though is that the release of Waiting for Tonight included a series of mixes done by another Puerto Rican DJ, that being Hex Hector. Hex Hector's name is synonymous with a particular kind of anthemic sound, a convergence of an epic rhythm section, streamlined vocals, and booming percussion. In fact, the next year, Hex Hector would win a Grammy for Best Remixed Recording Non-Classical for his remix of Mel C's I Turn to You. And before Hex Hector was a notable remixer, he originated in the Clibillis and Cole circle. That said, we can't deny the power of Hex Hector's remixes for artists like J-Lo, Mel C, and a mix I guarantee that you've heard, his remix of Deborah Cox's Nobody's Supposed to Be Here. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. 1994 is when Robbie Rob's Boricua Anthem is released. While Rob Clibillis, is the visionary behind this project, it's fair to say that he also had some help. So we know that a lot of the Spanish language rapping and toasting on the record is done by Panamanian MC El General. In fact though, 3 other people are credited as writers on the track: Danny Vargas, Victor Vargas, and Angel De Leon. Danny and Victor Vargas are brothers, who had previously created the track Boricua Posse under the name Rare Arts in 1991 for Strictly Rhythm Records. De Leon, a member of the rap group Trilogy, works on Boricua Anthem and is later credited on another Vargas Brothers release, this one called La Bandera by Just Two Brothers. La Bandera meaning the flag, as in the flag of Puerto Rico. Now, a record like La Bandera is emblematic of the Latin house sound which develops kind of in the wake of Boricua Anthem. This would be a house structure with a panoply of Latin instrumentation and percussion throughout. And we can consider all of these records to be different expressions of the Puerto Rican, or at least New Yorican experiences that draw from Latin musical traditions. Here is another quote by Rob Clibillis from the NYC Tastemakers interview. When people ask me what my favorite records are, I say Boricua Anthem and Gonna Make You Sweat, Everybody Dance Now. The reason why is because when I did Boricua Anthem, nobody ever did a record like that. Boricua Anthem is the first Latin house crossover vocal record. It was the first time that someone made a vocal record to put out in the American scene, and it's dear because that record came out the year that my partner passed away. Sony dropped CNC Music Factory during that record being released, so Boricua Anthem never got out to being promoted as a pop record, because I think it would have been as huge as Gonna Make You Sweat if Sony would have put it out and promoted it. And although they did not promote it and they dropped the group, the record was so strong and so influential at that time that it's become an underground international classic hit to this day. And while I agree that Boricua Anthem is still massively influential, it's worth noting that some of Clibillis' contemporaries had already experimented with the format of an overt mashup of Latin diasporic genres and house music. We can point to records like Two Dopes, A Touch of Salsa from 1990, which is produced by Kenny Dope, and also Ride on the Rhythm from 1991, produced by Louis Vega and featuring Mark Anthony, La India, and Doug Lazy. I would describe A Touch of Salsa as more of an exploration of textures, while Ride on the Rhythm is a veritable crossover hit that brings house, hip-hop, and Latin flair all together. But it does beget a conversation about the marketability or perceived marketability of records deemed too niche by virtue of being Latin-centric. Keeping in mind that this is in 1994, a number of years before the reggaeton crossover of the early 2000s. Personally, I can believe that the label didn't push Boricua Anthem as much as it could have because a genre such as Latin house was still in its gestation. If we fast forward a decade, we'll see records like Libre by Mambana able to easily reach global success, Mambana being a European act. In my mind, Boricua Anthem was slightly ahead of its time, and believably it could have faced marginalization because of centering a Caribbean Spanish dialect and ethos. This also begets a question of how any group of people who are denied opportunities in traditional job markets are able to succeed in entertainment and nightlife. this perhaps being a partial explanation to the staying power of New York City's nightlife. Here is where I want to talk about the actual mechanics of how Latin music and house music can overlap. I'll be quoting from the Beat Portal article, How Latin and Afro Sounds Conquered House Music, written by Harold Heath. Heath says, "What unites all these genres is rhythmic complexity, a defining characteristic of Latin music. Layers of interlocking, syncopated percussion played on instruments like the bongos, timbales, congos, claves, cowbells, shakers, maracas, and the güiro make Latin rhythms so devastatingly effective on the dance floor, which didn't go unnoticed by dance music producers starting in the early 70s. The article goes on to name Latin freestyle as its own particular predecessor to the sounds of the 90s. Quote, Todd Terry, who's obviously not Latin, was producing some of the biggest Latin-influenced tracks at the time, and he made some of the biggest freestyle records as well. For the record, in doing research for this video, pretty much everyone I've mentioned has specifically called out Todd Terry as being one of their indelible influences, so keep that in mind. Quote, as far as how Latin House started, it was that Latin sound that Masters at Work incorporated into their productions and remixes in the 90s. Guys like myself that have grown up in New York and were Hispanic, Puerto Rican, Latin American, or whatever, we've grown up in this culture, listening to salsa music and Latin music. Then we incorporated those sounds into the music we produced. This exchange between places like New York, Puerto Rico, Miami, Jamaica, and Panama is credited with the development and popularization of genres like dancehall, reggaeton, and dembow. Can we say the same as it pertains to house music? Now, I don't have a definitive answer, and I think it's a little tricky to say because the Spanish language music industry and the Latin house genre are siloed from each other. In a recent interview with the Miami New Times, Puerto Rican producer Caleb Calloway had this to say. Nightlife in Puerto Rico is different, especially when you're younger. You can go out at 18 instead of 21, but there aren't many clubs and the focus isn't on electronic music. In New York though, everything changed for me. I started going to places like Le Ban at the Standard, where I was exposed to house music, new disco, and experimental bass music. That's really where I learned everything about the scene. My guess is that there's somewhat of a lack of opportunities for house DJs to learn and develop their craft in Puerto Rico. What do you think though? Let me know in the comments. In any case, the duration of the story is mostly contained from between 1987 and 1997. By the mid-2000s, the OGs of this Puerto Rican-centric Latin house scene had fallen out of the limelight, being replaced by other types of Latin house and quote-unquote tribal house sounds. When we look at the dance music craze of the late 2000s that came after it, it was mostly driven by European DJs, David Guetta, Axwell, and Tiesto, among others. DJ Sneak attests to this in a 2009 interview with Resident Advisor. Quote, in the last couple years, I found myself going from being the main room house guy to being pushed aside to the side room. Be that as it may, the golden era of house music is a continual source of inspiration. To whatever extent that Puerto Ricans were among the architects of the genre, aside many different other people, it does beget a question of how much of Puerto Rican music and culture is within the fabric of its very DNA. Personally, I think the answer is quite a bit. At this moment, Bad Bunny is playing his historic residency at the Coliseo de Puerto Rico to support his widely acclaimed album Debí Tirar Más Fotos. In a moment of much national pride for Puerto Ricans on the island and in the diaspora, I hope this video can add to that discussion and that overall movement for cultural sovereignty. One theme of this channel is rejecting assimilation and imperialism, which are key themes of Bad Bunny's most recent album. If you clicked on this video just for the music history, I encourage you to dive deeper into the history of Puerto Rico itself. Topics like the Jones Act, the 1950 Utuado Uprising, the history of the Young Lords, and the current utilities crisis on the island will enrich your knowledge greatly. At the end of the day, Puerto Rican history is American history, and we all have much to learn about the people in the margins of both. Alright guys, that's the video. Thanks again for making it this far. What's your favorite record, DJ, or act mentioned in this video? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you're a little bit older than me and have some more stories from back in this general period, I'd like to know them in the comments as well. This is Hassan with the Diaspora Gothic channel. Remember to stay connected, stay rooted, and stay dramatic. Bye!